fellowship, we gather today, and I pray that you will have a blessed weekend, and that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart stick true to your word, for the message to go forth for people to receive. And we just thank you for this wonderful day. Amen. Okay, so today, actually I was driving and I realized I had said last time I was going to do a continuation and I didn't, so I'm breaking that, but at least I'm confessing it. But today we're going to do hair. And I thought, it's just something that came to me, and I thought, so let's talk about hair, but how many places can you think of that the hair is mentioned in the Bible where it's kind of important? It says that he knows the number of hairs on your head, that God knows that. So, we think of hair as maybe something not so significant, but yet it is. Hair is, it kind of helps keep us warm. We have the whole thing with Esau had lots of hair and Jacob didn't, and there's an entire portion of that story. I hope that this sermon's not a hair-raising experience. You get cold or something, you get goosebumps, and the goosebumps actually kind of make the hair follicles stand up, which traps more air and keeps you a little more warm, because it's kind of like when you're scared, it's kind of a chilling experience. So hair is kind of interesting. It also is one of the few things in your body that kind of keeps growing after you die. Like fingernails will keep going for a little bit, hair will too. So we know that those are actually facts, not just something made up in horror stories, because it doesn't need a lot of oxygen, but they can keep growing. But anyway, today I'm going to focus on a couple of passages more than anything else. But one of the kind of issues that at least the Bible talks about, and we're going to get into the weeds here a little bit, but that hair can be associated kind of with vanity, with feeling self-important. I think you can look at, if with enough hair and it takes time to take care of it. I don't know how many of you guys remember the country musician Crystal Gayle, because her hair was like at least to almost her knees. It was incredible. So can you imagine just trying to prepare that and protect it and everything else? Hair can be braided. You can put stuff in it. And so you can spend a lot of time working on hair. And we're going to get into that a little bit. And I'm just kind of going through the Bible kind of in order of just some of the different comments about hair before we get into the two stories that I really want to use. But in Isaiah 3:24, and he said, instead of fragrance, there will be a stench. Instead of a sash, a rope. So a sash would be a nice piece of cloth, but a rope's just a rope. Instead of well-dressed hair, baldness. Instead of fine clothing, sackcloth. Instead of beauty, branding. And so they're talking about that, instead of all these things, it's going to be the exact opposite. So, instead of well-dressed hair, braiding, and all this stuff, no. And then Proverbs says, charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. And so they're talking about that, that as you get older, things are going to change. Your hair changes. One of the things that I've noticed lately is even the texture changes as you get older, but it probably becomes a little more brittle. The texture changes. The color can certainly change. I don't have the same color hair that I used to as a young man. In 1 Samuel 16:7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Now, that's one of the things about the description of David is they didn't say, oh, he had just a nice head of hair and he was gorgeous and all this kind of stuff, and he wasn't tall like the other brothers. So, David did not meet the descriptor of being somebody that was good to look at. And here's where in 1 Peter 3:3-4, they're talking about a kind of a conflict that was going on, and you can find it in other passages, but a conflict between the people who were following Christ versus the people of the community. And when they talk about in the section that women should cover their hair in church. I don't really think that they're picking on the woman as far as saying that she has to have something over her head, that it's not that she should be doing that. But what he's kind of trying to say, and this is when you get around to it, is that in Corinth, especially, the women there would spend a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of work on their hair, and they would have all this stuff woven into it and everything else. And if you remember being a child, in fact, there's a lady that I'm not going to mention, but in our church, that when she travels, she has her own little suitcase for her jewelry. And my daughter was a little girl and just loved that. She was like impressed, like just trying to see what jewelry she's going to wear today, whatever. And so you could see that somebody in a church, if their hair is really done and impressively done and all that kind of stuff, it could be a distracting. And so I think that's what they were kind of getting at, is that's why they wanted the coverings, because you could look, and let's face it, if you spent that money on Monday to have your hair done, you might want to leave that hair do good for a week or two. So I think Paul is in that part was really talking about covering the head in order to not be distracting. It's more of that kind of thing. I don't think he's really trying to make any other statements about subservience to men or anything like that. I think he's and really where your position is with God, but he's maybe just saying, hey, let's don't distract people. But it kind of goes in here when he says too, your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart with imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. And so, like I said, hair can be a vanity, can be but I think that you're kind of seeing that on even, we know even in this country, wigs, people, they didn't have hair, they'd go start using wigs and things to cover their head. And, that's one of the things of the emergency department that is, it's a difficult thing even for the healthcare providers, because they have a wig, but yet we need to examine the skin. We need to see what's under the wig. And we want to be respectful to that person. We may have to run people out of the room because they may not know that this lady's wearing a wig. We're pretty good at spotting it. I hate to tell you that, but we can kind of tell. But at the same time, we want to respect them and make sure that their feelings are protected and whatever. But and let's face it, sometimes with trauma, all your vanity kind of just vanishes. Vanity vanishes, maybe that's a term. But anyway, so we've got the thing there. And then in 1 Timothy 2:9, this is Paul talking as well. I mean, and now moving to Paul, I should say. And he says, I want the women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes. So he's kind of saying, be careful. Well, the story that I want to start with, I'm going to do two stories about hair. One, I'm going to do Absalom and David because, we'll get into it. And the second one I'm going to do is we're going to talk about Jesus getting the woman who washed his feet and anointed him. But to get into this first passage, there's, I was listening, and they're talking about how that we have books in schools that children should probably not be reading, and I agree with that. And then, well, what should they be reading? And you can go through that, and I could even say, I don't really know that our kids should be reading all parts of our Bible when they're young. I'll never forget when my son was sitting with me in the evening, and I was reading from the Bible, David and Goliath. And we get to a part where Goliath goes down, and to me, that's the end of the story. And I'm really good with that. I'm fine with that. I'm ready to leave the room. I said, my son stopped and says, no, Dad, read the part where he cuts his head off. Let's get to the PG-13 R part. Let's get there. And so I was like, okay. And then I was like, so I asked my wife, did you read that? Do you keep going? She, no. But for a period of time, he loved that story because obviously he's a little guy and there are big people around him. He can identify with David. But she said, oh, no, I don't read the part where they cut off his head. And I'm like, our church is teaching him about cutting his head off. Okay, thank you, God. You know, but there are parts, and this section is basically, and I do, and it's on the to-do list reading sometime if I ever get the time. There is a book that is written by a I'm blanking what her, I don't know what her is, but her husband's a seminary professor, and she is in like sociology or psychology or something. And they've written a book about dysfunctional people and families in the Bible. And our Bible's full of it. Well, this David's family is dysfunctional. You can't say it's not. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to start though with where some of the conflict started. So David had, and we're going to get into this too because it's part of the story, but David had multiple wives, concubines, multiple children, and so let's face it, Solomon was not the oldest at this point. Absalom was the oldest. But then there were other ones, and there was a son named Amnon, and Absalom had a sister named Tamar. And I'm throwing these names out right now. As we get further into the weeds, when I start talking about some of David's men, unless they're really important, I'm not going to go into that because there's a lot of names about these people around David, and they do a good job of journaling that, but I don't know that's important to the story, so I'll just say that up front. But bottom line here is that Amnon lusted after his sister, and he does everything he can to get close to her and everything else, and he ends up even basically commanding that she comes and cooks a meal and feeds him, and he rapes her. And, bad family dynamics. David was mad. David didn't do anything, but David was mad. Absalom, who's Tamar's brother, was really not happy. And it says, like, at the end of all this, so Tamar lived as a desolate woman in the house of her brother Absalom. So it destroyed her. So Absalom lives with that reminder of what this other brother did, and he wants his vengeance. But Absalom, I guess you'd have to say, was cool and calculating. He was not fly off the handle. And it also said when King David heard of all this, he was furious, and Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad, because he hated Amnon for violating his sister Tamar. Totally reasonable, totally understandable. Well, it becomes the time of the year for shearing sheep, which is literally cutting off the hair of the sheep. I guess let's kind of go stay with the hair thing. We're going to cut off the hair because we're going to make clothes out of the hair of the sheep. And so Absalom invites his brothers and specifically wants Amnon to come to the shearing. Make it a social event. There's work to be done, obviously, but, let's get Amnon in there. And then, but he invites David, and David, of course he's polite and asking his dad to go, and David's like, I think you see some things, and we'll talk about this, that David's kind of getting a little older, and he's like, I can go out in 105, or I can stay in the air conditioner. I think I'll stay in the air conditioner. You guys have a great time. And so he still wants Absalom, though. He's trying to cover his bases. And so he says to David, well, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. Now, the king's not stupid, but he doesn't always ask all the right questions. He says, why should he go with you? The king asked. Why? Why? We know there's a list. Why? And he basically keeps talking, and he just talks David into it. David's like, fine, okay, Amnon will go with you. Well, Absalom, cool and calculating, tells his guys, he said, watch Amnon till his heart is merry with wine, and when I order you to strike down Amnon, you're going to kill him. Well, all the men around are going to go, but David's probably not going to like this. And David's ultimately the boss, but there are also men that Absalom knows are loyal to him, and they're sitting saying, this is number 2. So if number 2 says this, maybe I should listen in because David's getting older, and someday he's going to go, and Absalom's going to be in charge. So I guess I'll kill him. Basically, that's where it boils down to it. And so they did it. Well, word has to get back to David, so runners or going from the sheep shearing back to the city, and there's more than one runner. David probably has his own group of spies and stuff. There are people that are loyal to him, and so runners go. One of them gets back, and he basically says that they've killed the sons of the king. Didn't know all the details and whatever, but then they end up finding out that it was only Amnon that died. So David, he mourns about that, and he's not happy. So anyway, it's one of those things that, but now Absalom's kind of on the run. So he fled. Well, then David first mourns for all of them, but then the rest of them come back, and the sons of the king have arrived, and so David's happier about that, but it's still, he and Absalom are at crosswise now. And it said that Absalom fled to the king of Geshur, but David mourned for his son every day. Now, it doesn't say for sure which son, but I think we're thinking it's Absalom he's mourning for. Kind of thinks, Amnon probably kind of deserved what he got, But Absalom, and maybe David's even thinking, I should have done justice for Tamar, but I didn't. And so Absalom did the justice thing, and there's a lot of stuff going on here. Well, Joab knows that Absalom's gone, know that David would really kind of like to have him there. Joab's kind of the middle guy, and, you don't, how much political, how much, who knows, is Joab totally faithful to David, or is he also kind of saying, well, Absalom's number 2, so if King David died today, we'd have to go get Absalom. So he concocts this plan with this woman of Tekoa, which, you're going to hear that again, because remember there was the vine dresser of Tekoa in a different passage. But anyway, he gets this woman from Tekoa to go and talk to David and basically say that her 2 sons got in a tussle. One of them died. Now the people want to, kill the other one. She's basically telling the same story to David that it just happened to his family. It's kind of funny how these people kind of get that in. It's like the whole thing about the guy telling David about Sheba and how that the lamb, and so they're doing the same thing, and they're basically, and so now, hand over the one who struck down his brother and all this kind of stuff. And so David finally says, "Don't worry about it. You're since he's your only son, he's all the future you've got. We won't kill him." And then so she kind of, kind of says to David, "Why have you devised a saying like this against the people of God? When the king says this, doesn't he not convict himself, since he has not brought back his own banished son? So either you're supposed to take care of Absalom for killing his brother, or you're supposed to bring him back and it's all okay. What gives? What's going on?" And then the king says, basically, is the hand of Joab behind all this? In other words, David still figures stuff out, but it's kind of funny that he doesn't, And so he says, "Okay, bring Absalom back." Tells Joab, "Go do it." Well, Joab does it. And David says, though, when he brought him back, the king added, "He may return to his house, but he must not see my face." There's a blockage. You're back, but you're not in my graces. You're not. Now, this is where we get the description of Absalom. We've gone through all this story of Absalom, but we really don't know that much about him until this one passage, verse 25. "Now there was not a man in all Israel as handsome and highly praised as Absalom." So just think about top movie star United States. This is him. Yeah, Pastor Beeman. It's him. It says, "From the sole of his foot to the top of his head, he did not have a single flaw." Boy, wow. Oh, maybe it does take Beeman out of the running. Sorry. "And when he cut the hair of his head, he shaved it every year." Now, I don't know about you, but after about a month, my hair gets a little longer and I need to cut it. This guy doesn't cut his hair except for once a year. And he said, when he shaved it every year, because his hair got so heavy, he would weigh it out as weight. So they say that's about 5 pounds. He's got 5 pounds of hair. according to the royal standard. They actually put it in scales, and it's kind of like an event every year. My kids, if you watch my kids, they've got a tradition that they both do. They're gingers. They have red hair, and ginger's not a common. It's like 1% of the population to be a blue-eyed ginger. And so my kids have this deal, and they've done it, like I said, since somewhere in high school. They started growing their hair, and so they don't cut it but once a year. Man, they trim a little, but both of them don't grow it, don't cut it. And then every year they get it cut, and they have it cut into pieces and send it to make wigs for kids with cancer. And I will not name the most common one you're thinking, but they actually charge, which this place does not charge the kids for the wigs. And so that's the one they donate to. So they've done all the research. This is what they do. So it is something that in my heart, growing up in West Texas where men kept their hair short, it bothers me. But then I have to keep realizing what they're doing, and I have to get over that, because my son wears a man bun part of the year and all this kind of. I'm like, oh, we never did that as culturally. My culture, talking about the hair, it's not a vanity thing for my son, but you could think so. And it's different with the girl. She can do what she wants to. That's another double standard we have, is what happens with the guys versus what happens with the girls. I'm just saying, throwing it out there. It's my cross I must bear, and I need to. Okay. Now, 3 sons were born to Absalom and a daughter named Tamar. So he names his daughter after his sister too, who was a beautiful woman. Okay. Absalom lived for 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing King David, and he's trying to get in there, but he's also trying to get Joab. And hey, Joab, you got me here. You did all that stuff. How come you can't get me to the king? Well, Joab's not going to talk to him. Like, Joab's literally blocking him off too. So Absalom, conniving, burns Joab's field. So now Joab's got to come talk to him, and he's mad, and he gets to talk to him. And so he says, basically, I want to be around the king. And then at that point, Joab works it out, and so Absalom does come to the king. He falls on his face. David accepts him, kisses him. So now you got Absalom back as being number 2 man again. All good. However, Absalom then, gets, like it says, he provided for himself a chariot with horses and 50 men to run ahead of him. Got his own little security detail. And he would get up early and stand by the road leading to the city gate. So now you got 25 guys on one side, 25 guys on the other, and you've got Absalom, and people are coming into the city. The people of Israel are coming to Jerusalem, coming to the temple, coming to do business, coming whatever. And Absalom's out there, and he's stirring the pot, as they used to say. If you had a judge over you guys in Israel, things would be better. It's too bad that David's not appointing me as judge over you guys. I would hear your cases, and I would be, whatever. And he goes and on. And so it says, so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following increased. Whoa. So he's undercutting his dad, just doing it. Well, then there's a plot, and that basically they kind of said, okay, after 4 years, I'm going to go and basically take over the palace and everything else, and told the Israelites to come for justice and all this stuff. So he's now got an army, 200 men, and they have planned to go and take over. Well, word gets to David, and what's David's response? Oh, no, they're not going to do that to me. I'm going to stay right where I am. We're going to fight under this. Well, it's a civil war, too, you got to understand. Now we have a civil war in Israel. And David runs, and he gets out, and everybody in the countryside was weeping loudly as all the people passed by. Because David, who should be their leader, their king, their head honcho, is now in dust and not refined, and he's fleeing. So what is that, like the people are, what's going on? Well, and then there's this guy that also is there Ahithophel, who's now an advisor who used to work for David. Now he's working for Absalom, who gives him advice, and we'll get into that in a minute. But the other thing that goes with David, which is kind of interesting, is the Ark of the Covenant goes with David. It gets carried out the city too. And at some point, David kind of comes to his senses. Now, we don't know if David asked for the ark or if the priest just brought it, or we don't know what happened. It doesn't really talk about that. But David's kind of like, the ark really belongs in Jerusalem. Not about me. That's not my ark. That's God's ark. And so, which is good. He comes to his senses and sends the ark back. Well, David is kind of despondent now. He's upset that his son has done this. I told you that guy that was a counselor with a long name. He basically says, hey, here's what you do. Sleep with all David's concubines that were left behind. Let's just take care of that. And, it's one of those weird things. You're like, huh? Were they willing? Were they unwilling? What was going on? And then you're like, well, yeah, but he's a looker. There's all these things. You're like, what the heck was this? But yet he does it on the roof too, like blatantly, like very bad look for David. Very bad look for the kingdom. Very bad look for Absalom, but they did it. Well, at one point they're going through an area and this guy named Ziba brings stuff to David. And he says, donkeys for the king's household to ride on, the bread and fruit for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who become exhausted in the wilderness. So they're traveling, and this guy does it. This guy's a servant of Mephibosheth. Now, if you remember who Mephibosheth is, he was one of Saul's children who had an injury and basically was paralyzed and couldn't leave. And this servant brings this stuff, but said, well, David's like, well, where's Mephibosheth? Is he in our party? And the guy says, no, he decided to stay behind. Now is that a loyalty thing? Is he now saying he's going to be loyal to Absalom? Is he hoping that he can connive Absalom and making him king? Back to Saul's line. There's all these political things going on. You're like, okay, I don't know. But that's going on. And because the king asked, where's my grandson? Where's the grandson? My master's grandson. Where is he? And he is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks today the Israelites will restore to me my grandfather's kingdom. Well, along the way, a guy named Shimei curses David. And so one of the guys got his sword and like, you want me to cut this dog's head off? And David's like, no, let him talk. You're the king. Why would you? You never see a lower point, I think, in David's life than when this stuff's going on. And David basically tells the guy, he said, I don't know if God's told him to curse me or not. That may be his right to do that. God has kind of cursed me with all this other stuff. Maybe I earned that. Maybe I don't know. That's his thinking. Leave him alone. Oh, that's really hard for those guys to hear. Nobody talks about the boss, but it's happening. And the guy even goes on the hill, and as they're walking, he's yelling down at him curses as he goes. Well, now we get to the heart of the matter of, sleep with the concubines and everything else. And then they get to, well, what's our strategy? What do we do next? What are we going to do now that David's fled? So the guy who advises him to sleep with the concubines comes up with a plan and says, let's just take our army and just go attack and take care of them. They're in the wilderness. What's the problem? Well, one of the advisors also was David's man he's the double agent. He came in to work for Absalom and looked like he was loyal, even though he wasn't. But he has made it into the Absalom, potential future king's court, and he's an advisor. And so Absalom's like, well, what do you think? This guy says, let's attack. What do you think? And it's really kind of interesting because of what he says, but at the same time, he's really looking out for David. He says, well, if you attack David right now, he's got those mighty men of valor, which you're like, well, how many are there? Apparently there's a lot, because they talk about, they sent, an army guy over hundreds and thousands, and, so they got all these soldiers. David has the army, sort of, but this guy says, well, David might be in a cave, and we might not end up killing him, and that would be bad, and they could regroup, and we could get beaten, and that's not good. He said, why don't we summon up our Israelite army, get everybody, and then go after them? That sounds like a better plan. Well, the guy that was the advisor at Ahithophel or whatever, this guy goes home, settles his affairs, and kills himself. You're like, huh? Well, he gave the king his advice. He was obviously looking for some kind of power and everything in this whole thing. And when his advice wasn't heeded, he doesn't feel like he's really all that anymore. And so he basically offs himself. Isn't that crazy? If your advisors kill themselves every time you don't listen to their advice. But that's what he did. And so this other guy tells him, no, let's get the army and go. And so they start raising that. And like I said, David is still running. And so they come after David, and they have a fight. And like I said, there's a lot of soldiers. But what was really interesting is that David took some. I told you, this is part I want to read about the numbers. David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent out his troops, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and a third under Ittai the Gittite. The king told his troops, I myself will surely march out with you. Like, I'm going to lead you. You got three groups. I'm number one. Y'all got three. Well, this is where it gets even funnier. But the men said, you must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us to die, they won't care. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better now for you to give us support from this city and stay hidden. You're like, well, wait. What was that? You don't want the king to go out and fight? You don't want the king to be in charge? You don't want the king to... So it's kind of like they're kind of usurping David's authority, but they figured out a way to do it with honeyed tongues to say, hey, you stay behind. And they're also got to say, it's kind of hard to protect the old man now. Why don't we just leave him at home and we'll take care of business? And so there's all this intrigue. There's all this, David's not, the other thing that's kind of think is David still kind of got some sense, because by splitting the army up, it's not like that any one is in charge who could come after him. Now, if he had one commander, if Joab, for example, Joab could wipe out Absalom and then come back, kill David, and be the king, right? Well, David's kind of split that up. So, but they tell him, and David listens to that, like, oh, I'm worth 10,000. Well, I will stay here in the city in the air conditioning when it's 105 outside, and y'all go have a great time. Bizarre. I will do whatever seems best to you. That's what David tells them. Well, they go and they fight, and they win. Civil war. Israel's troops were routed. But I thought that was really interesting because it says casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. The battle spread out over the whole countryside. Now this was the part that I don't understand. And the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. We don't have forests here, so I guess I don't fully understand it. Are these troops getting in there and getting lost? I mean, I will tell you the one thing that's kind of weird for me for a forest is it's like having a cloudy day because you have trouble seeing the sun unless it breaks through the trees. You get confused of which way is north, which way is, there's that, where there are beasts in there, where there are animals. They talked about, we're getting into the middle bit, but they throw Absalom's body in a pit where there are things that were dangerous about the forest, where there are marshes, where there are snakes, where there, I don't know. But it basically said the forest did more fighting than the sword. Okay, which I think is important because we're going to get to that. So Absalom, and this is where this one section, I'm going to spend a little more time with it because there's a lot of controversy about this. I'm not trying to give you the answer. Now, Absalom happened to meet David's... No, we'll back up. Sorry. Where was this? Here we go. Now, Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule. And so, in other words, he was riding by himself. and then something happened, and then he met David's men. That's the way I should say this, but that's not the way it says it. But that's it. Now, Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule. Now, the other thing that's important, a mule, not a donkey, not a horse. A mule, actually, for them was a war animal because it's big. A donkey's little, a mule, Christ rode the little colt. It's a war mule. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches, and here it says a large oak. There's actually other translations that maybe not an oak, different kind of tree, which I think that's important too. It says in one translation, Absalom's hair got caught in a tree. He was left hanging in midair, while the mule he was riding kept on going. But it also says that Absalom's head got caught in the tree, and he was left hanging in midair. A lot of translations say head, which is the word Rosh. Like when you talk about Rosh Hashanah, that's like the first of the year. The head of the country, the Rosh. So head means this, but it also can mean leader, someone in charge, someone's over, whatever. But anyway, the point of the thing is that Absalom is now caught in a tree. Now, I have ridden horses and stuff. I had a little pony growing up. She loved to go into trees and rake me off. If you're not careful, she knew how much height she needed. Now I don't know that the mule did this. I don't know that the mule, had an evil bone in his body and decided to do this. Not necessarily. But the mule knows that this is okay for me to go through, and that's all he's thinking. He's not necessarily the brightest animal. My pony knew to go under trees. It wasn't. She was intentional, and so you'd always keep on your guard around trees because she would try to rake you off, and so you couldn't let her get around branches because she'd do it. Well, what we don't know, and this is where there's a lot of controversy just about that one sentence, is that. There is a difference between hair and head, and in a way there's kind of not, and so I want to take that argument too. It's still kind of the same body part, but what really happened, people try to split it, and then people want to get into camps. And the two camps, let's start with the hair camp. The hair camp is that he got his hair caught in the tree, and there's actually, I was reading something that a woman was in that part of the country, and the wind blew and caught some of her hair. Different type of tree, not an oak tree. But it caught her hair, and she had to get people to help her get it out. So there is that option that he could have actually been caught by his hair. And then you're like, well, but then he was a guy of war. Why didn't he just break his hair, or why didn't he just take a knife and cut himself free? What is also, people are trying to write into this, so they're trying to interpret it and put it in. They're saying that he was going back to David, so he was becoming a man of peace. I don't want to die, and so he didn't have a weapon. So he was heading to kind of make restitution. And I did leave off. I left an important detail. When David sent the guys off to fight Absalom, he basically said, "Don't hurt him. You can't kill him. Don't." And they all heard it. He said it openly. It wasn't like in a closed room where people would say, "Oh, I didn't hear that right." Oh, no. He made that announcement before they left. They're not supposed to kill Absalom. So was it his hair? And then the other thing we know about hair, if you get a little of it caught, and if it's that kind of a tree, it's kind of like, Velcro, going to kind of keep sticking maybe, and, I don't know. Artery struggle, maybe more hair caught, I don't know. Okay, now the part about the head, because like I said, there's people that argue about the hair. And the reason they also want to argue about the hair is because, let's face it, Absalom was a vain person. He was into his appearances. He had beautiful hair. He was a looker and had this great hair. So having that vanity caught as his, downfall, so that's how that a lot of us remember that story, because we think of the hair because of what's said before. He's caught in a tree and he's caught by his hair. He's hanging by his hair. That's where our brain goes. So is that right or wrong? I don't think it really matters, but I just want to throw that out there, because that's where you're going to go. Because I think, and that's, as a kid, I'd always remembered hair, but how far back can I get? I can't. I'd have to try to really dig to try to get deep enough in the Bible to figure out. But the other one is the head. His head gets caught. This is where I start kind of forensically being an emergency physician. If you get your head caught, that's a different deal. So you need to have something probably that you get. And for that to happen, there's also a pretty good chance that when he goes in there, that he breaks his neck. But it depends on where he breaks his neck. If he breaks it down a little lower, he can't move, but he can breathe. Because it says when Joab's people got there, he was still alive. And so it could be that, and you have to, even with that, you have to be careful, because to make it where that he's not dead, stays alive, is that it's not pressuring his vessels in his neck, choking him down, and he's able to breathe. So it'd have to be like a fork branch, something he gets caught in. And the other people that talk about that, they kind of throw in there that they think that, Absalom was weeping, that he was sad, he was, had bad things happen, he's hoping for forgiveness, that he was crying, not paying attention, hair got in his way, got his head caught, who knows. I'm just telling you, there's two camps, you can accept either one. But basically, David's men come along and say, he's hanging from the tree. We got him. And so Joab comes along and basically does the blessing. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I'm just joking. He takes 3 spears and he sticks them through his heart. Boom, boom, boom. Stab, stab, stab. And then the other soldiers all kind of get in and do the same. They just pummel him. So Joab was disobedient to David, but also loyal to David. Or also looking out for himself, saying, well, someday maybe I can get. But he could have gotten killed by David for doing what he did. He was told not to do it. He disregarded his order from his boss. But he could always say, but he was a threat to you. I had to do it. The other thing you could say, maybe, if you're going to take the part, maybe he broke his neck, you could say, David, he couldn't move. He was paralyzed. He's not going to survive this. It's not going to be good for him. So I just finished him off. What arguments can he make? I don't know. But he ends up killing him. And then they take his body. And this is why I said we know that there's some kind of pit in that forest, because they threw his body in a pit and then put rocks on it. And they covered him up. And so that's the end of Absalom. But when David gets the news, he mourns and mourns and mourns for David. Oh, my son Absalom. Oh, my Absalom, Absalom, Absalom. And Joab's hearing this, David doesn't go after Joab, which is kind of amazing. He didn't say, Joab, you got to die for killing it, whatever. But he finds out, he knows. But he starts grieving for Absalom. Severely grieving. Joab even comes to him and says, wait, boss, you realize what you're doing? You got all these people that have fought for you, and yet they've been very faithful to you, and you're not mourning them. You're not mourning the troops who died for you, and you're all going after this low-life son you've got. It says, today you have humiliated all your men. What kind of ruler are you? Look what you just did. These people died for you, and you're going to mourn him? Now, I am going to throw one thing out there, because it is, and you got to be careful, and I don't want to do too much of this, but you got to be careful and say, well, New Testament, Old Testament, whatever. But if we want to talk about David, a man after God's own heart, you got to admit that David has forgiveness. And it's kind of like, no matter what we've done, God can forgive us. And God can be like David in that deal. Now, you have to admit God still cares about all of us, which is not what David's doing. But isn't that incredible that he mourns that so much for that kid? But I have to look at that passage and say, God does the same thing for us. Jesus died for us just the same way. Just as if we were Absalom, who'd done all this bad, and he still cares about us, forgives us, and loves us as a father, because we're his children. I just throw that at you. Just something that, to me, I couldn't get past in the story of what is wrong with David. But then again, it says he's a man after God's own heart. So Just something for you to chew on. Now, the other thing we're going to talk about hair, because we're going to move to New Testament. There's the passage where Mary of Bethany took a flask of spikenard and came to Jesus and anointed his head and his feet, and she wiped the oil off like his feet with her hair. Okay, let's back up a little bit, because this is all in the text. I'm going to tell you, feel free to read it. It's all in there. But the things that they don't cover is, where did they get this spikenard? What is it? Where did it come from? They're not talking frankincense, myrrh. It's spikenard, whatever the heck that is. It's a fragrant oil, and it comes from the Himalayan mountains. And so it has to be harvested and processed and transported back then all the way from the Himalayas to Israel. You did it right. The money. In fact, here's what gets kind of fun about this story. In fact, Judas Iscariot, the treasurer for the group, who's taken a little off the side, he skims a little and he's in charge. He says, "But Master, that's worth 300 denarii. A denarii is 1 day's wages, so 300 denarii would be basically all the wages for a year, because you got to admit you're not working on weekends. So you take those out, and you still got about 300, 52 weeks of the year. You can do the math. Basically, a normal laborer spends an entire year to make enough money for that oil. And so Judas's response is, hey, why don't we just take that and sell it and give it to... But Jesus says, no, she's doing the right thing. And you're like, okay. Now, there is debate, too, about who is Mary. It just says Mary of Bethany. And there's a lot of Marys in the Bible, and we don't know. There's Mary Magdalene, Mary whatever, Mary Mother of Jesus, whatever. People kind of get all that twisted. And I don't know who this Mary was, and I don't know that it really matters to me, but Mary did it. But the thing that she did, now apparently this stuff is really fragrant. So if I took it and put it on your head, this whole room is going to reek. And she took an entire vial of it, and she put it on his head, and then she put it on his feet, and then she took hair and wiped it. Now what Jesus is saying, because it's very figurative here, let's go back to David. We can use David. How did we know that David was supposed to be the king? What did Samuel do? He put oil on David's head. She crowned Jesus as the Messiah, as the Christ. Around all these people, nobody had really done that. Who do you say I am and all that stuff. But she actually went and said, he's it. And she did it with something that would be fit for a king. And so she does his crown, puts it here, like crowning him as king. And she does his feet, and she doesn't let it really go to waste, so she, uses her hair, which means she's going to smell good too. But she doesn't want it. I mean, it's expensive stuff. Don't let it go on the floor. What do you do? And so, yeah, it's nice if she does her, but you got to see that she did two things with that. One, she said he's king. She said, to me, there's no debate. This is the king. He's it. But the other thing that she does, because you got to look forward a little bit, is remember Jesus died, and they just basically wrapped him and threw him in the tomb. They didn't do the proper burial for him, and so the women that went to the tomb and find it rolled away were carrying spices and cloths to do this. So she simultaneously crowned him as king, but did his burial anointing oil and stuff, preparing a body for him to die and be in a tomb. But the other thing that we don't get in this story, because we don't think about it that much, but if it's that fragrant, can you imagine Jesus carrying that cross by and everybody going, oh my gosh, What is that smell? That is unbelievable. Can you imagine all those disciples? I mean, you probably have that scent in your nose for days. Like, if it's really that kind of stuff. And so it was a constant reminder to all of them who their boss was and what had happened. And so I just throw that at you. It's kind of a little interesting twist that I've never really thought about and heard about, but the oil was really expensive by anybody's standards. Judas was upset because he couldn't skim anything off. If they sold it, put in the treasury, there's 300, and he could take 10 off and nobody'd notice. And then she takes something to her that is priceless and gives it to Christ. He takes something that's priceless and he goes to the leaders, and for 30 pieces of silver, he sells Jesus. So there's also that contrast there of what she did versus what Judas did. If the world had responded the way that she did, it'd be a different way of looking than what we have now. But he sold him out. And so I just want you to kind of think about that. But the hair is involved because she anoints his hair first. She does it lovingly, does it. And the guys are not sitting around just letting the moment go and say, yeah, he deserves this. They're like, oh no. We're simple people and we don't do this. And, no. And the second thing then is, like she says, he does his head, does his feet, And so she basically has done something. And he basically says, she's doing the right thing. She's doing it. Great service. Love it. Doesn't say it, but hey, there'll be a special place for you in my house. I'll get you, you're a good lass, You did a great thing. And they don't understand. It just totally blows their mind. And you can see why. But he's priceless. She took something that was priceless, kind of, and put it on the priceless thing. And Judas takes something that's priceless and sells it for 30 pieces of silver. Yard sale. Anybody got any prayer requests? Anything we need to talk about? Okay, I'll close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank that you know that the number of the hairs on our head. You're in charge. You're the boss. You know what's going on. We thank you that Jesus has come. And we thank you for this anointing that he had to prove that he was king to us while he was on earth. And we just wish that we were smart enough to know that that's what we owe too, is we should anoint him with our thanks, with our praise, with our lives, with the things that we do, the things we say, the way we treat others, just like you've taught us. And we just pray that you'll go with us this week as we go forward and for the rest of the events of this week. Amen.
Great day. And thank you for tuning in to A New Day Fellowship Church. We are so grateful that you joined us, and we pray that you were blessed by hearing God's living word. May his message inspire you to continue walking in faith, trusting that he is working all things together for your good. As we close out this service, feel free to leave a word of encouragement in the comments and share your testimony with others. Together, we can inspire and uplift those around us to live for God. Remember, this is your season. Hold on to his promises, stand firm in your faith, and watch as God does great things in your life. Continue to be blessed, and we look forward to seeing you again. Stay encouraged and keep shining his light.